The Marco Rubio and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez confrontation in Munich did not look like a typical American partisan fight. That is part of what made it so important. There was no hearing room collapse, no domestic debate stage, no House floor explosion. Instead, there was something subtler and in some ways more revealing. A split-screen battle over the meaning of American leadership played out in front of a foreign audience that was listening not just for policy, but for signs of what kind of country the United States now thinks it is. Marco Rubio stood in Munich as Secretary of State trying to steady the room. That was the job. Europe had spent years dealing with shock after shock from Washington, tariff threats, alliance doubts, accusations about immigration and censorship, and the recurring sense that old transatlantic language could no longer be treated as automatic or stable. Rubio arrived in that atmosphere to say something soothing but strategic. The United States and Europe, he said, belong together. America is in some sense the child of Europe. Washington is not walking away from the alliance, even if it also believes European leaders have made serious policy mistakes. That is a very carefully designed message. It reassures without fully retreating. It restores emotional continuity without surrendering leverage. It tells anxious allies that the family still exists, while also reminding them that the family has rules and the United States intends to speak more sharply inside it. Rubio is good at that kind of message. He knows how to sound like the steward of an old order, even while carrying the sharper edges of a newer one. He can speak the language of alliance, seriousness, and institutional continuity without fully abandoning the nationalist critique that helped reshape Republican foreign policy in the first place. That is what makes him such an interesting messenger. And it is exactly what AOC was prepared to challenge. Because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez does not hear alliance language the way Rubio wants it heard. She tends to ask a different set of questions. Who benefits from the rhetoric? What material security does it actually promise? Whose interests are being elevated inside the phrase, "We belong together"? When leaders speak in the language of civilizational nostalgia, is that real democratic explanation? Or is it a soft, focused cover for older hierarchies of power that no longer deserve public trust on inherited terms? That is why her criticism of Rubio mattered. She did not simply say his speech was weak or unconvincing. She said it sounded like cultural nostalgia, an attempt to ground the U.S.-European alliance in a familiar emotional story without saying enough about how that story materially benefits populations in either Europe or the United States. That is not a small critique. It is a critique of the emotional foundations of post-war American leadership. And that is what turns this from a foreign policy disagreement into a confrontation worth studying. Rubio wanted to calm Europe with a message of continuity. AOC wanted to puncture that continuity and ask whether it still means anything if it cannot answer harder democratic questions. That is the heart of the clash. Rubio's basic proposition was that alliance language still has value. In an unstable world, the United States should sound like a responsible power, one that can reassure allies even while criticizing them. Europe needs to hear that Washington is not simply abandoning the relationship. The room needs to believe that the basic architecture still holds. AOC's basic proposition was almost the mirror image. The architecture may still stand, but that does not mean its language is honest enough anymore. If a speech about alliance relies too heavily on shared cultural inheritance and too lightly on concrete democratic and economic outcomes, then it risks sounding like a defense of old elites talking to each other in a familiar code. That is why Munich was such a perfect setting for the clash. The Munich Security Conference is not just another gathering. It is one of the central ritual spaces of the transatlantic policy class. Ministers, diplomats, defense experts, legislators, analysts, military figures, and journalists gather there to perform seriousness, continuity, and strategic purpose. It is a place where power talks to itself in its most polished voice. That makes it useful to a figure like Rubio, who wants America to sound coherent and adult again. But it also makes it vulnerable to someone like AOC, because the conference's entire emotional structure depends on certain ideas feeling stable: alliance, responsibility, Western partnership, strategic community, shared destiny. AOC entered that space and challenged not just one sentence from Rubio, but the comfort of that whole emotional vocabulary. She was asking whether the old words still do enough honest work. That is a dangerous question in a room like Munich, because rooms like Munich depend on rhetoric that can stabilize. Diplomacy does not always thrive on maximum moral or economic explicitness. It often thrives on carefully calibrated reassurance. Rubio's speech served that function. It did not have to answer every question. It had to stop the floor from shaking. AOC's intervention refused to let the floor settle so easily. That is what made the confrontation real. Not because they were personally feuding, but because they represented two different theories of what foreign policy language is supposed to do. Rubio believes language should steady alliances, preserve confidence, and signal that the United States still knows how to inhabit leadership, even after years of rhetorical damage. AOC believes that language must also account for who pays the cost of old alignments, who gets protected by them, and whether appeals to civilizational belonging are sometimes just elite nostalgia disguised as strategy. That is a profound disagreement, and it matters because it may preview a much larger future divide in American politics. The old bipartisan foreign policy center still thinks in terms of credibility, stewardship, alliances, deterrence, and continuity. Rubio can speak that language fluently, even from inside a movement that has often strained or weaponized those ideas. The insurgent critique, especially on the younger left, is less willing to grant those words automatic legitimacy. It asks who benefits materially, who gets sacrificed, what is being obscured, and whether global leadership rhetoric often survives by sounding morally elevated while remaining economically and democratically vague. Rubio's speech and AOC's response brought those two vocabularies into the same room. That is why the clash deserves more attention than a normal clip battle, because it tells allies and rivals alike something uncomfortable but important about the United States. Even when Washington tries to sound steady again, there is still a deep internal fight over what steadiness means. For Rubio, steadiness means restoring confidence in the alliance while keeping room for sharper American pressure. For AOC, steadiness without democratic clarity can look like a glossy shell, too polished to trust, too familiar to question, and too detached from ordinary people's lived interests. That distinction matters internationally. Europeans do not just listen to the American government, they listen to the American argument. They want to know not only what the current administration says, but what fault lines are opening underneath it. When Rubio says we belong together, and AOC says that language sounds culturally nostalgic and materially thin, Europe is hearing two Americas at once. One America says the architecture survives. The other says survival of the architecture is not the same thing as renewed legitimacy. That is a hard message for allies to absorb, but it is also an honest one. And maybe that is why this confrontation is more significant than it first appears. It happened on foreign soil, but it was also a domestic preview. It previewed the argument that is likely to define a great deal of American foreign policy rhetoric in the years ahead. Can the United States still rely on the emotional capital of old alliance language? Or must it now justify itself in much sharper democratic and material terms to its own citizens, as well as to its allies? Rubio thinks the emotional capital still matters. He may even think it is indispensable. Without it, every alliance conversation becomes more brittle, more transactional, and more vulnerable to collapse. AOC thinks emotional capital without deeper explanation is exactly the problem. It keeps old patterns alive by making them sound natural, inevitable, or civilizationally necessary rather than politically contestable. That is why neither of them was really just talking about Europe. They were talking about the story America tells about itself when it stands in front of the world. Rubio's story is one of inheritance, responsibility, and restored strategic confidence. AOC's story is one of questioning inheritance, exposing what responsibility leaves out, and refusing to let confidence substitute for accountability. That is the deeper clash, and it is why Munich mattered so much as the stage. Because international conferences often hide domestic fractures under the etiquette of diplomacy. Rubio came to speak that etiquette fluently. AOC came to interrupt it just enough to make the fracture visible again. Once that fracture becomes visible, the old language cannot sound fully innocent anymore. Every reassurance now carries a question beneath it. Who is being reassured? Who is being asked to trust? And what exactly is supposed to make that trust feel earned? Rubio answered with tradition, alliance, and careful strength. AOC answered with skepticism toward nostalgia and a demand for something more concrete. That is why the clash still echoes, not because it was loud, but because it turned a well-managed diplomatic stage into a glimpse of a bigger American struggle. Whether the language of leadership can still survive on inherited moral authority, or whether it now has to pass through a much more suspicious democratic test before anyone should believe it. And that is not only a Munich problem, that is the future of American power speaking out loud. There is another reason the Rubio-AOC confrontation deserves attention. It revealed a difference in who each figure believed he or she was actually talking to. Rubio's speech was directed outward, toward diplomats, ministers, security officials, and the allied political class. His job was to restore confidence among people whose work depends on the assumption that the alliance system still has a center. AOC's response was directed both outward and downward. She was not only speaking to Europeans in the room, she was speaking to Americans at home who increasingly distrust elite foreign policy language and want to know why international commitments are always framed as obviously noble, but so rarely explained in material terms. That means the confrontation was also about audience. Rubio was trying to restore elite confidence. AOC was trying to deny elite language the right to sound complete. That is why her critique felt disruptive, even though it was not shouted. It reopened the gap between diplomatic performance and democratic persuasion. It reminded the room that speeches can reassure insiders while still leaving large numbers of ordinary people unconvinced that the bargain is fair or the rhetoric is honest. In that sense, the clash in Munich was not an exception. It was a preview of the fights to come. Because every future American administration will face the same pressure. It will need to reassure allies abroad while justifying itself to skeptical voters at home. Rubio represents the instinct to preserve continuity first and defend it later. AOC represents the instinct to refuse continuity unless it can first survive more aggressive public questioning. Those instincts collided in Munich, and the collision mattered because both are politically alive, both are growing stronger, and both are likely to shape how the world hears America in the years ahead.